we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and support the recognition of traditional Aboriginal law across the nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging on this land. Hello, I am Jenna Chanel Hayes and this is The Loving Podcast. As we all know, Australia has a terrible track record when it comes to the treatment of refugees and people seeking asylum in this country. Globally, there are currently around 80 million documented people who have been forced to flee their homes. In addition to this, there are also millions of stateless people who have been denied a nationality and lack access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, employment and freedom of movement. Today's guest is deeply invested in fighting for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers caught up in the Australian legal system. She is a powerful warrior woman, providing pro bono support to some of those most in need. She's my friend and human rights lawyer, Alison Battisson.
Happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you here. Well, I guess first things first, can you tell us about your work at Human Rights for All?
Sure. So I'm the Director Principal of a charitable law firm called Human Rights for All, and it focuses on providing legal representation on a pro bono basis for people in immigration detention, specifically refugees and stateless people, of which there's a growing number in Australia.
Well, I met you while I was working on my latest project, Aconi, and we connected in regards to refugees being subject to deportation in Australia. Can you explain to us?
Yeah, Australia has a very draconian refugee status determination process. It's one of the most tricky to navigate in the world, and we are the only Western country that has mandatory detention of people without visas. There are some crimes in which a person who has come to Australia, if they've committed, should result in a cancellation of a visa, except where you look at refugees and the stateless, because those people are so vulnerable. And the only place they have to go in terms of refugees is back to their country of recognised harm. And for stateless people, there is nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So it's effectively double punishment. So it has quite a discriminatory impact. It does things like if someone is accused of a crime or charged of a crime, but not found guilty, or it doesn't even go to trial, that person can languish in immigration detention and be excluded from ever applying for another visa unless personally invited. So as an example, I've got a gentleman who was accused of a crime, spent almost 2 years in jail. When it got to the morning of the trial, the police dropped it and went, actually, we're not going to take this forward. Immediately taken into immigration detention, has no other character concerns, and he's going on 5 years, just sitting there.
And the police, they dropped the case.
They dropped the case, but because his visa was initially cancelled due to character concerns, even though there's no criminal record, it excludes him from all sorts of remedies to get him out of detention. And at the moment, the only remedy is a habeas corpus unlawful detention action, which we just succeeded in winning Australia's first one.
Well done.
So we changed legal history, which is fantastic.
Amazing.
But to roll that out for the number of people potentially unlawfully detained is an enormous undertaking.
So is he released now? Is he?
Not the one who's going on 5 years. He's on the list of people to commence these actions for, but the person who we bought it for goes by the acronym AJL20. He's been either incarcerated or in detention for 10 years, and he's only in his late 20s. It's insane. And a week and a half ago, he walked out of immigration detention without a visa, but also not a citizen, just on a writ of the court.
So what happens now?
The government appeals because they do not want this set as a precedent, but it's something that happens once in a lawyer's career. It's just when I got the decision, I started shaking. I was like, Jesus.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing.
Well done.
But there's a lot of people like that. You know, I've got another client who arrived as a child. He's 16, he's now 23. He's never seen the outside. That cannot be lawful. So, yes, Australia has rightly been condemned by almost every international body and every human rights body.
How many of Australia's asylum seekers are fleeing conflict?
Depends what you define by conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the vast majority are. I'm not sure there's any statistics on this.
Okay.
But certainly 90% of my clients are in detention and are refugees. I would say 80% of them are fleeing conflicts. And are fleeing conflicts that are between extremist organisations and more small L liberal organisations or governments and come to Australia fleeing those regimes, and then we lock them up. Again, for example, a couple of my clients were Saudi journalists. They got to the airport and were detained because it became clear they were going to seek asylum because they're also homosexual. And they have commented under their pseudonyms about how Australia's immigration regime and the powers that govern it, it's very Saudi. You punish everyone for the actions of one person. Mm-hmm. They weren't part of a conflict, but they provide some very interesting commentary on what's happening here.
Right. And so where are they now?
They're free. We got them out at the end of last year. It was an enormous effort. They're now working and living happily and loving it. Love Australia.
Yeah?
Yep, absolutely. And people recognise them in the street and come up to them and say, oh, we're so sorry, what happened to you? Is there any way we can help? And just delightful.
So this
true
is
Australia.
Because of the media?
Because of the media. Yeah, the government made a huge mistake in detaining 2 gay journalists in Sydney, you know, with Mardi Gras. So the LGBTI community rose up. And then they'd worked with ABC, Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC. So all their mates got on board and pressured the government. It was fantastic.
Amazing. Is that a rare case where the success?
Yes. So we got them out within about 2.5 to 3 months. Most of my clients have been detained for over 7 years. I've got one who's at 11 years, who has cancer and is dying. I've got another one who, because of a major depressive disorder and a mistake in his refugee assessment for 7 years, is slowly starving to death because he's so depressed that he just can't consume any nutrients. He's taller than me, and I'm 5'8", and he's under 45 kilos. So it's this regime that has created a type of illness called resignation syndrome, where you just give up on life.
Yeah. Like, is there any support that these people can go to?
Not on the scale that you think there should be. So you have major issues where the detaining authority is also the authority that's responsible for primary health care, for the well-being, for initially assessing whether someone should be invited to apply for asylum. So in Australia, if you arrive via boat, you have to be invited to apply for asylum. You can't just put in an application. So I have a gentleman who was released 2 weeks ago, which was extraordinary. He sat in detention for 6 years with no invitation. Literally nothing happened on his case for 6 years.
Who was representing him? Like, did he have lawyers and...
So there's no right in Australia to legal representation. So these people are hidden, often don't speak English.
Offshore?
They can be offshore. Manus and Nauru is an enormous problem. Christmas Island is classified in the onshore regime, but the ability to communicate with people there is very difficult. So people are warehoused in faraway places that just make everything too hard. And if you're already depressed or you've got a disability, and the detention centres are full of people with disabilities, really, cognitive impairments, intellectual disabilities, so they don't know how to advocate for themselves. They don't have the accommodations to do that.
The more time they spend detained, the more they may develop or further develop mental issues or...
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't think it takes a doctor or a genius to figure out that if you're subjected to an indeterminate period of detention, that might impact your mental health. You may not be too happy about that. The other thing is that increasingly the detention centres are very violent places, because it's not just refugees, it's also people from New Zealand or the Pacific Islands or the UK or anyone else, the US, waiting to be returned to their countries of origin.
And why have they been detained? Why are they?
So they've committed crimes, and some of them quite heinous, violent crimes, and are in detention whilst the arrangements for deportation are being made. They have no incentive to behave in an accommodating manner in immigration detention because they're already going to be deported. And there are gangs in these detention centres, not of refugees, but of hardened criminals, who have their own rights and things, but putting a very small Hazara man from Afghanistan, who's, 5'3", without a lot of muscle, in with an enormous Pacific Islander has led to some massive issues where a number of my clients, I'd say on a weekly basis, call me because they've been assaulted. And some of them have suffered such assaults that they're permanently disabled. One of my guys had to have his, sorry for the graphic image, the skin of his face peeled off to operate on his eye socket, his eyes and his navel cavity. He's got, his head's kept together with staples. And it took another 2.5 years to get him out. He's got permanent eyesight issues, hearing issues. His face is no longer symmetrical. So people, look at him funny. And here's a surprise, he's hugely traumatised and paranoid because this shit happens all the time. People are raped in detention.
And when that happens, the moment that happens, what is the process? Is there any protection that is put in place for this person?
If you make enough of a fuss, maybe. If you have a lawyer who will advocate for you day after day and at any hour, maybe.
But they're not guaranteed any legal representation, so...
No. And our detention centres in Australia are federally run, which means the AFP is responsible for them, and Border Force, Australian Border Force, and they're all under the same umbrella of the Department of Home Affairs. So how can you complain that Border Force didn't report your rape to AFP when ultimately it's the same body that looks after both of them? There's no separation. It's a ridiculous situation. And most police officers won't go into immigration detention.
Because
it's too hard. And they don't understand who has jurisdiction. So I spent quite a lot of time trying to explain to New South Wales Police that there's a memorandum of understanding in place with the AFP, that they're the first responders. And they're like, I don't know anything about that. I'm like, please educate yourselves. It can be, and there are great people in immigration detention, but it can be an incredibly violent place. And that's changed over the years from when there was more just pure asylum seekers there, when it used to be 80% asylum seekers, 20% people waiting to go home, and now it's the other way around.
Really?
Yep.
And is there any plan? Why are they not segregated? Why are they...
Yes. That would appear to be sensible.
Yeah.
No, there appears to be no plans to have separate... If you are going to detain refugees, and there's a mixed group of refugees with criminal issues as well, if you are going to detain refugees, then do it separately. But there's no plan.
There's no plan?
No, I brought that up with a departmental officer last week, actually, and he said, yes, that would be very sensible, but no one's looking at it.
And why are they not looking at it? What is...
Because the current regime has a narrative around how they will control who comes into Australia and how they come, and that people who are different from us are dangerous.
Other.
They are other. And people tend to focus on the other to avoid looking at issues domestically. So it works for them. So many issues. For example, Australia doesn't have a visa for stateless people. The UK does. For refugees, for complementary protection. You're not a refugee, but you'll be harmed if you go back. And then stateless people. So there's a gentleman, goes by the acronym of M47, who doesn't know what continent he was born on. He's been in detention going on 11 years.
And why doesn't he know?
Well, you actually can't attest to your own birth. You know you exist, but it's hearsay. Someone else has actually told you where you were born, what time you were born, because he has no family. So his memories are very confused. But if he sought safety in the UK as opposed to Australia, he would have just been given a stateless person's visa.
What's his journey? Do we know any?
We do. He went from the West Sahara, we think it's the West Sahara because he remembers a lot of sand, to an orphanage in the Canary Islands.
So there's no documentation?
No.
Wow.
No documentation. People who live undocumented are fundamentally disadvantaged. And he doesn't even know if the name I know him by is his actual name.
Wow.
Then he was airlifted to Madrid because Spain owns the Canary Islands and the orphanages were overcrowded. And when he was about 8, he escaped that orphanage because he was used to living on the streets and around. He made his way to Paris where the police tried to pick him up. Then he made his way to Belgium where a gentleman who spoke the same-ish language as him said, come and live with me and my family. Bad idea. So he was made a house slave for a couple of years He escaped when he was about 10, made his way to Amsterdam, where he got picked up by a criminal gang because he's amazing at languages and he blends in. So he speaks about 10 languages. He speaks Icelandic, for God's sake. I mean, who speaks Icelandic except for people in Iceland? And then he eventually made his way to Norway, where the gang was his family. They fed him, they clothed him, gave him accommodation. But he finally went to a school and discovered this other life that he wanted. And the gang is not one that you can leave. The only way to leave is to be killed.
Yep.
Last year there was a severed head that was found in the canals of Amsterdam, and that's the gang. These people are not mucking around.
Yeah.
So he came to Australia.
How did he come here?
By plane.
He flew in?
He flew in, yep. And he's still here in detention.
So he was at what happened at the airport when he...
The use of a passport that perhaps wasn't his was flagged and he was placed in immigration detention.
Last year. So he's been in for...
No. This was in 2010.
Oh, 10 years.
Yeah, he's going on 11. Yeah. So if you look up on Wikipedia, for example, statelessness, he's one of the listed examples.
So if he had, instead of coming to Australia, if he had flown to the UK, which is much closer, he would have been granted most likely or 100%?
Oh, very, very likely. Very likely. And again, no other country, comparable country, has a regime like ours. So I'm almost certain he would have been granted a visa and just gotten on with his life. And if not, he certainly wouldn't have been detained for 11 years.
In regards to the process, if people decide they want to go back, if he wanted to go back to Belgium?
No, because he's got no right of return. For example, there's a large number of Iranian Kurds in Australia's immigration detention centres, of South Sudanese Dinka people. The Iranian Kurds, Iran won't take them back. They're very happy that the Kurds have gone. And places like Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, they're not really functioning states. So there's no government to accept these people back. So we just warehouse them in detention centres for years.
Without legal representation? Yeah. Unless they've got someone like you.
Well, and there's a number of organisations that do work in detention, but we solely focus on detention. The complex cases and then the systemic issues, which we try and bring up with the United Nations at any opportunity we possibly can.
How easy is that?
It can be. I've just had a situation which for 10 days, finishing about a week ago, I woke up every 2 hours during the night to check submissions and make submissions to the UN on a particular case. It can be taxing in that circumstance. The issue is that international law functions are toothless tigers. There's no enforcement mechanism. So the UN can issue interim orders, which they have for some of my clients, demanding release, and Australia just ignores them. And
Australia specifically being our minister?
Yeah, the whole Commonwealth. So the seminal case we just won, AJL 20, where we got the writ of habeas, was against the Commonwealth, not just the Department of Home Affairs, because the department fits within the Commonwealth. Australia is a sovereign state. We should be able to control who comes here in the circumstances they come. It's a very famous quote in Australia. Whilst that is 98% true, every time Australia signs a treaty, multilateral or unilateral just with one other country, or when we joined the UN, you make an assessment on your sovereignty then. You give a little bit of away because you say to other countries, we will act in this particular way. And if we don't, you should be able to hold us accountable.
Yeah.
So by becoming a member of the UN, you are signed up to the UN Charter, and every nation has signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because it's a declaration. We have made a sovereign decision to sign those documents and comply with the terms of them, and we just don't. We look like we're a good international citizen, but in this respect we're not. We have the benefit of this reputation, but not the burden of actually complying with it. And we should choose one or the other. If we're not going to do it, withdraw. Just be honest about it. Our government at the moment is not very good at being honest about refugee issues and detention and other things. It's a very opaque, murky space.
You mentioned before a couple of times rape. I don't feel like there's much information about females travelling this journey. Am I right, or is...
Yes and no. I think there can always be more. There is a recognition that, and it's a horrible statistic, and I don't know how far it's been investigated, but the vast majority of women who have fled conflict and are seeking asylum have been sexually violated in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What that doesn't flow through to is a recognition that being a woman, and particularly a girl child, is itself a particular social group. That is a separate claim for refugee status. So if you are an Iraqi family, husband, wife, say 3 kids, all under 18, 2 are girls, 1's a boy, those girls and that wife have very separate claims to the men in the family. That can be reversed. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, there is a large incidence of male rape in the prisons. And if you've left the country irregularly, you will be detained when you go back. And you will be placed in a prison where you know that this happens as an instrument of control and torture. I have seen a number of decisions by the Australian government that hasn't looked into gender issues. And issues of sexual violence are distressing and difficult to discuss and accommodate. So I do think that they can get left behind, yes, absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, these are irrelevant considerations that bear large. I know, it's stunning. I can see the look on people. I do a lot of talks on this subject as people who are newish to the subject.
Which is the majority.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the problem. We don't talk about these issues, but these things are happening and essentially we are all responsible because we all live here.
Yes, and we are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what do you think is going to happen if you detain a young man who's already traumatised for an indefinite period of time, let's say for 10 years, and then you let him out and there's no educational background, there's no skills, there's no vocational skills, there's no academic, because you don't get any of that in detention. You're going to be very angry, traumatised, not have a high ability to cope in modern society. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that brown Islamic men with beards are dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, we've contributed to that a lot. Very short-sighted, very, very short-sighted. And there's not a large number of these people. There's maybe 500 refugees in immigration detention. This is excluding offshore, the APODs and Manus and Nauru, but in the onshore cohort, it's not going to change Australia's ethnic makeup or cultural makeup or anything else. And
So there's around 500 onshore.
yes.
What's the total on and off? Sure.
So in terms of detainees, there's actually 1,500, but I think about maybe 500 to 600 of those would be refugees. And with offshore, that number of total people detained would probably blow out to 2,500 to 3,000, with 1,200 being refugees. Again, small numbers that should be very easy to solve.
How fast
Slow.
Yeah.
The answer to that.
Are there some that are quick?
No. I wish there were. Not that I see, but again, we do take the complex long-term refugees and those really hard cases that have perhaps been through the earlier, easier stages and hit obstacles that maybe someone who's legally funded can't overcome, or, like legal aid funded or something else. So our firm has made a decision that once we take on a client, we keep them and therefore the institutional knowledge of that client until they're released.
Yeah.
Or they sack us, which, hasn't ever happened, but, so it can, I've had clients who've been there for half a decade.
How long are they generally in the system until you come along? Does that obviously change?
Over half a decade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you how do they make contact with you, or do you make?
Our number, the law firm's number and my personal number is just passed through the detention centres.
Do you take everybody that you are referred?
If we have capacity, yes. We have massive capacity issues because there's so many people that need assistance. So detainees refer themselves or they refer another detainee. I have this lovely story of a Iraqi gentleman that I was assisting who's now out after 7 years. He called me one day and English was very poor. He just said, Ali, woman, Africa, help. And that was it. And I was like, all right, well, I need to now in the detention centre network find who this woman is who'd been subject to terrible sexual violence.
By?
A range of entities and people. And she'd been given 4 days by the department before she was going to be deported. So I had to find her within 4 days, then get in a protection visa application to stop that deportation within the 4 days, which we did. And she's now a recognised refugee out in the community, at university, working, owns her own car, renting her own home, all that utterly fantastic, but it's because I had one Islamic male client who identified that this was someone who was very distressed and upset.
And what was his connection to her?
Fellow detainee.
Right. In the same
detention centre.
Okay.
Yep, just saw her crying and went, oh, maybe Ali can help. Like,
wow.
All right, give it a go. So, and advocates, approach me about extreme cases. Fair Trials International, which is based in Europe, will call me about a case because someone's contacted them.
Mm-hmm.
We are not short of referrals.
Yeah.
What we are short of is lawyers who can accept a low pay and that we can fundraise for to do this sort of work.
You told me the other day about the Indigenous man who...
Yes, yeah. So there's, on documents that have been discovered through legal action, there's approximately 8 people in immigration detention who have Indigenous claims. Mm-hmm. One was apparently released very quietly 2 weeks ago.
Oh, why very quietly?
Because it would be an acknowledgement that they were unlawfully detained prior to that, and there might be a claim.
Right.
So it's fairly new law in 2020, at the beginning of 2020. Someone who's got Aboriginal heritage and meets a number of other tests does not fall under the alien's power in the Constitution and therefore isn't subject to the Migration Act, which allows detention. Mm-hmm. So we had a gentleman who we got the court to declare that he was biologically Indigenous. He identified as Indigenous, but because he was recognised by a different Aboriginal mob than he identified with, biologically identified with, we couldn't get the court to get over that hurdle to order habeas for him. And he was dying of cancer, separated from his stolen generation partner, very, very minor historical criminal charges.
Historical, how long ago?
25 years. And some other ones that are older than I am. And, I'm in my 4th decade, so I'm like, geez, I wasn't even alive then. So we do take some Aboriginal clients, and during the pandemic there were no deportations. He was from New Zealand, and he lost out because his original tribe was so decimated by white Australia that there was only one family left that could acknowledge him, and his own family had been entirely wiped out. It just shows decades and centuries on the impact on Indigenous people. One of the great things I love about A Coney is...
Don't tell anybody, nobody's seen it yet.
Oh, no one's seen it yet. Anyway, there's a great scene in it. But when people do watch it, there's a scene that absolutely one person gives help to another person.
Yeah.
And that has reflected my reality of how I sometimes get clients.
You can say who helps who.
An Aboriginal person identifies that a brown asylum seeker in the community needs help. And I had a Commonwealth Games athlete who was sitting crying at Central Station, and an Aboriginal woman who was a member of Mums for Refugees identified that he needed help, and that's how I came to represent him. Mm. Aboriginal society has been so decimated, and yet there are these amazing acts of kindness that have enormous impacts on people's lives. Like, he's now in the process of getting a protection visa.
Wow. In 2001, Prime Minister John Howard said, we decide who comes into our country and the circumstances in which they come. As a country still governed by a white majority, do you think whiteness remains a core part of this we in the decisions that are being made in regards to refugees?
I mean, it's a one-word answer. Yes, it does. So you see that with mandatory detention. If you don't have a visa, you must be detained. It's really only brown people that are detained whose visas have run out or they're refugees. So you don't see a lot of backpackers from Britain who don't have criminal records. This is putting that aside. Again, the gay Saudi couple that got to immigration at the airport, and then the blonde au pairs that got to the same point, and the minister intervened on compassionate grounds for the very white people, but didn't do that for the gay Saudi journalists. And that's, the gay Saudi journalist arrived here the year after Khashoggi was dismembered as a journalist in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. So it's very clear that if you are, in the same profession, let alone LGBTIQ, that you're at risk of harm. But there was no intervention there. I do think there is a fear of Islam, a misunderstanding of Islam. That comment was made around Tampa and the Children Overboard crisis, which I was actually working as an intern in Parliament House then for Senator Warren Snowden, a Labor senator. A week later, September 11th happened. So it all got sort of brushed under the carpet because, September 11th was quite a big deal.
Yeah.
But Labor missed a massive opportunity then because they had no policy. And you could see people running around like crazy trying to figure out what to do. And so they just adopted the Liberal policy. And that's where I think everything went wrong. This exclusion policy, this fear of boat people. And again, the Refugees Convention, not a lot of people know this, but it was amended effectively in 1967 because it only applied to people within Europe, not to the rest of the world. So to sort of white people in Europe who were seeking asylum. And then in 1967 it was expanded to apply to the rest of the world. But for example, Turkey, that takes a huge number of refugees, they never signed the 1967 protocol. So all the refugees coming from Syria and Iraq, other places in the Middle East, they don't have to classify as refugees. They don't have to treat them according to the Refugee Convention. So it comes from white origins, and Australia, we have run with that. And it's such a pity because it's not reflective of our society and our culture anymore. We are changing and we should change, but there is an absolute racist element to it. There are not a lot of white people in detention. So I go in as a white atheist woman, and I go by Ali, which is spelled A-L-I, which is Ali. So often people think that an Arabic-speaking brown man is going to turn up, and then I rock up, they're like, who the hell are you? And I mainly represent brown men. And I have never been treated with such respect and dignity and protection. I love going to the detention centres. I'm treated like a queen. The only time I've ever felt uncomfortable is being looked up and down by the guards.
Wow.
Yep.
And the guards are white Australian men?
Yep. I go to the maximum security area where all the seats are bolted in and the walls are literally carpeted, and I have to sit in a particular seat in case I need to run out in an emergency. I'm like, I'm not sure what emergency you think is going to happen here. My guys are delightful and lovely. There's all sorts of sets of double locked doors, so I go through. I'm drug tested, I'm metal detector tested, all my stuff is gone through. I can't even take a paperclip in. I have to get special permission to take a phone or a laptop in. I'm not allowed as a human rights lawyer to go into the general visiting area. They got intel on me one day and threw me out of the detention centre because people wanted to talk to me about their human rights. How dare they? I mean, it was such a joke. So there's almost nothing I can take in. I go through then 2 sets of double locked doors. For the higher security one, there's more. I have to show my wristband and my face at every door so they know it's me going through and proving it. And then I got to a final door and they sat me in this seat and they're like, oh, by the way, the door behind you doesn't lock, so if your guy tries to make a break for it, could you stop him? I may not. Just throwing it out there. I feel like that's probably not. What? No, I'm not good at. And he's going to hit another door, and I could. All that was out there was a very crappy female toilet and a sort of security control centre, and then there was all these other doctors. And I was like, my guy, they're so beaten down he can barely sit in the chair, let alone
escape into a space that is locked anyway.
Is locked anyway, and I just. I'm not part of your security organisation. I'm his human rights lawyer. I'm not going to continue.
I'm on his side.
And I'm not going to continue perpetrating a crime or assist you in perpetrating a crime under international law. So no, I'm not doing that. All right.
I guess I'll do my job then.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh, get the door fixed. Here's a surprise. All the money that you spend on maintenance of these places, maybe in the maximum security area, get the door fixed. I deal with lovely, peaceful people every day. It's a delight, which is very different to how they're portrayed in the community.
And I think we need to change that.
Yeah, we absolutely need to change that narrative. And people who have gotten out and are free, they're family friends, they're friends with my children, they drop over at any time. That it's just enriched our lives so much in a very safe, comfortable, educational manner. Why wouldn't you want that?
Yeah.
I've got one guy who rode to Australia.
How?
Rode.
On what?
Big muscles. Yeah, seriously. He rode from...
on a bike?
No, in a canoe.
What?
Why didn't we put him in the Olympic team? These are highly motivated individuals who have figured out complex problems to get to Australia. I had another guy...
From where?
From Indonesia.
Canoe from Indonesia. Does he know how long it took him? How many?
No, I think he just kept going till he made it.
That is amazing.
Amazing.
Where is he now?
In detention.
What?
Yeah. I've got a bit of work to do on that one.
For how long?
He's been in and out a little bit. It's a developing situation.
Okay.
Another guy who was a professional soccer player, and some of his mates who escaped their country went to Europe, where they were traded for $15 million through FIFA, and they appeared in the World Cup. At the same time that the Socceroos were doing not so well in the World Cup, our guy was sitting in an immigration detention centre for 3.5 years. Again, why wouldn't you have let him out and just...
Is he out now?
He's out now.
And is he playing?
He's playing, yeah. But I think we could have used him. There's all these people with amazing skill, artists, musicians, poets, business people, doctors, lawyers. Dr. Munjed, who has created the osteointegration surgery for people with amputated limbs. We kept him in detention for years, and of his cohort, he was the last one to be released. And he's now doing the limbs for, I represented the Invictus Games athletes, 2 double amputees, 3 single amputees.
Where were they from?
Afghanistan. And they sought asylum in Australia, and we had to meet in all these undisclosed locations. It was a very stressful period of time. Dr. Munjed is now doing their legs. He's the only person in the world who came up with this technology, and we detained him for years.
How many years did we detain him?
He was in the earlier cohort, I think 2 to 3 years, and he was put in isolation because he got a bit shitty about being detained, so he read all his medical books. He was already a doctor. The Invictus Games guys fought the Taliban, and then the people who were repairing them are people that we've locked up, and, imagine, there's so much value there.
You've spoken to me about, quite a few situations, and I'm going to come back to this point.
Yeah.
Most of your clients have been male.
Yes.
In the stories that I've heard.
Yes.
Is this just the stories that you're telling me, or are they primarily male? Where are the women?
So you can talk about the patriarchy, and I talk about the patriarchy a lot. You do not want to be a man you do not want to be a refugee man in Australia, because even though it's arbitrary, mandatory to detain somebody without a visa, whether you've just arrived at the border and seeking asylum, or you've been in the community and something's happened to your visa, or you're on a bridging visa and it's just expired, you are far more likely to be detained if you're a man. So it is discriminatory. There will probably be almost equal numbers of women in very similar situations who aren't detained, and their children.
Right.
So what happens is the male head of the household, and I use those words very carefully because a lot of my clients are from the Middle East, so there is I would say, a gender imbalance there in terms of power, but I can't solve everything. So all of a sudden you have the male in detention who either stays there. So often the families are released, but they keep the father. And the impact on the families are...
Why do they keep the father?
Because they don't want to let everyone go. And there's this concept called constructive refoulement. So refoulement is a fundamental concept of international law, which is you can't return someone to a place of harm. No matter what else has happened, you can't return them if you acknowledge that they would be harmed in that place. What the Australian government does is make the situation of detention so horrible that the person voluntarily elects to go back to the place of harm. So if you separate the husband and the father and you keep him in detention indefinitely, then the family might go back.
Wow.
It's a strategy.
And how often does that work?
It does work. What it more often results in is huge anguish, mental health issues, poor educational outcomes for the children. I know one family has just become homeless because the father's been in detention for years, the mother's struggling with lots of children, doesn't know the support mechanisms, or is on a visa that doesn't have any.
How many years has he been detained?
Oh, look, this is such a common situation, again, 5 to 10 years. So there are entire generations of children growing up without access to their fathers. And in one case, a family I'm very close to, the father was in for 7 years and the children, who were 7 and 8 when they arrived, were in for 3 years. They no longer speak the same language.
Wow. And, I mean, if you're talking about it economically, the costs of...
Oh, my God.
all of it, the children,
So the base cost per detainee per year is, I think it's 360-something thousand. I have 5 Bangladeshi gentlemen who've all been in for longer than 8 years, who have never been in the community. They have no criminal records, absolute clean behavioural record in detention, which is extraordinary because I'd get a bit pissed off, probably break some things. The minimum cost for those 5 gentlemen for that period of time, I'd say, is $18 million for 5 people.
Isn't that crazy?
No criminal record.
And they're not given anything.
Anything. No education, no training, nothing. So...
And how's the food sitch?
Oh, terrible. Terrible. Yes, I've only been fed detention food once and I'll eat almost anything, if I'm perfectly honest. Smells all right, I'll have a go. I couldn't eat it. And that results long-term in a lot of health problems as well.
What was it? What did it look like?
So bland, overcooked, days-old white rice with like 2 pieces of chicken in it, and then a salad that I'm fairly certain was from last week that just looked inedible, and an apple, and that was it. But that's every day, every meal.
The same thing.
Same thing. So do you want the chicken and rice or the rice and the chicken? And it used to be that you could take food into the detention centres, but they stopped that.
Why did they?
I think they thought, the powers that be thought it was a security risk and people were bringing drugs in and doing... The ironic thing is that since the detention centres have become more like prisons, drugs are still going in. Not through the detainees.
Through the...
I don't want to be guilty of defamation, but I think there is evidence that implies that people who work within the system are bringing it in. Of course there is. It happens in prisons as well. But don't punish everyone for a problem that is not created by them.
Mm-hmm. Are drugs a big problem?
Enormous problem.
They are?
Enormous problem.
What kind of drugs?
Basically anything.
Really?
Yep. And the issue there is that you get people who are lent on to become addicted to drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of my clients who had broken a drug addiction, a very large gentleman came and put his arm around him and said, come and join us, and in a circle chatting, and my guy didn't want to go, but he was like, well, there's nothing else I can do. Okay, I'll sit down with them.
He was scared?
He was petrified because he'd been beaten up. He's another one who'd been beaten up, and sat down in this circle where everyone was smoking ice, and they knew that he was a recovering addict, so he was vulnerable. So if they could get him to be addicted to ice again, then he'd have to pay. So they offered him ice, and I was like, look, couldn't you have gone to a security guard or anyone? He said, no, he was in the circle with us. So the guards were smoking ice with the people pushing it.
This is onshore, offshore?
Onshore. Yep. So people can go into withdrawals. People can be fed bad drugs. And people can break after half a decade and go, screw it. They're not going to let me out. I'll try it. I probably would. Probably do it within the second day. Like, this is an awful reality. I want out. And then people are highly medicated on antidepressant, antipsychotic, all sorts of mind-altering drugs. And of course they're depressed. And some of the therapy for that is draw a picture about why you're depressed. Could it be because you're indefinitely detaining me? Yes, probably. 90% of my clients are men, bringing it back to that. And then you've got men being exposed to violence, drugs and mental health issues from societies that may not normally talk about those issues, with families on the outside who are desperate for the men to get out to be a family again and earn a proper income and support the children and guide the children.
Yeah.
It's a perfect storm for people not being able to comply with the behavioural rules of a detention centre, which is then that behaviour is used against them. So the father, with the boys that don't speak the same language, he was written up because he wanted to get to the visiting area early to set up a table for his son's, I think, 10th birthday, and they wouldn't let him do that.
And they wrote him up?
They wrote him up. He got angry and he yelled. And
what does writing him up mean?
It means they do a behavioural incident report and it counts against them when they then are considered for release.
It was his birthday.
Mm-hmm. His son's birthday, and all he wanted was 5 minutes beforehand. So when his son walked into the detention centre visiting area, he could, Dad's done something for him.
He could be a dad.
Yeah, yep, nope. And that was, one of the incidents that I had to address in his tribunal hearing and explain it.
And what was the response when you explained it?
I think the tribunal member he found in our favour. Of course you would. Yes, I'd be vaguely pissed off and raise my voice in those circumstances. These people are human.
Yeah. Do we know the percentage of, I'm coming back to the male-female thing, do we know the percentage of
men and women in...
Yeah, detained.
I don't off the top of my head, but immigration detention statistics are meant to be released every month, and you can check them on the Department of Home Affairs website.
Okay.
I think it's about 80% men, 20% women.
Yeah, okay.
Or maybe 90% men, 10% women. There are still 2 children who are detained, the Sri Lankan children from the Bilowiya family.
How old are they?
I think 4 and 6 at the moment. Such a danger to Australia's national security. I mean, terrible. And they're on Christmas Island, where the department at the moment is only sending, or meant to, only be sending people with serious criminal records to be detained.
When were they sent there? How long have they been there?
They've been detained for over 2 and something years, and they've been on Christmas Island for almost a year.
And they're with their parents?
Yes.
Both parents?
Both parents, yep. And these 2 girls were born in Australia.
So why were they detained?
Because the mother's bridging visa ran out the day before, and the department, in a 4 a.m. raid in their rural Queensland village where everyone loves them, swept them up. Yeah. Extraordinary. But there was another child, Isabella, who was my client, who's now 2.5, and she was released a month ago.
Congrats.
Yeah.
So what happened with that?
So she never actually appeared in the statistics because she was a guest in immigration detention.
For how long was she a guest?
Her entire life. Yeah, 2.5 years. She was born in immigration detention, and a couple of days, maybe a week at the most, before her mother was due to give birth to her first child with gestational diabetes, the immigration department came to the mother and said, if you want to have access to your daughter in immigration detention, you must sign this form releasing us from all liability and saying that your daughter's not detained and she's a guest, because she can leave at any time. That's not signing something under duress. Choices around bonding with the mother, breastfeeding, all sorts of decisions that...
Where else is she going to go?
Her father is in the community, but he's on a visa that meant he had to work. So if he didn't work and he looked after the daughter full-time, he would lose his visa and he would have to leave the country. If he worked and he was in not a great paying job, he couldn't afford childcare if she was in the community. And also, it shouldn't be the decision of some government minister as to how you raise your child if the child isn't in danger with the parents.
Yeah.
And this child was loved from day dot. They tried to deport the mother and the child together a number of times, and we went to the UN and stopped that.
Where were they trying to deport them to?
Vietnam. Australians in particular, I've been to Vietnam on holidays. My father used to live there. My father's partner is Vietnamese. And, it's like this cheap or semi-luxurious holiday for Australians, and you go to the beaches, Da Nang and wherever else. There is another side to it, and that is in particular rural Catholics. Because Vietnam is a communist state, you are meant to owe your allegiance to the head of the communist state, to the party. But if you're a Catholic, you owe your allegiance to God and the Vatican. The Vietnamese Communist Party do not like that. So they are a persecuted minority within Vietnam, but Australia refuses to recognise us. There are still boatloads of Vietnamese people trying to get to Australia, and they're stopped in Indonesia or Malaysia, and some have gotten to Australia and we turn them around. So there's still a push factor going on. But Isabella had never been to Vietnam. You know, her mum hadn't been there for years. She had a father here. The mother didn't have a statutory process, so she'd never actually been invited to apply for asylum. The government just decided she didn't need it. So that wasn't properly looked at.
Yeah.
And then this baby turned up that they just kept in detention for 2.5 years. And then one day when the mother called a very close advocate of theirs and close friend of mine and said, visa, and then basically hung up. And Rebecca Holt's the advocate and journalist, and she thought the mother had finally lost it. Like, oh, yes, she's had a psychotic episode. Of course you have. You know, you're trying to raise a child by yourself. And the guards were given instructions that when the baby turned around for a hug, not to recognise the child, not to pick her up, not to comfort her, to leave everything to the mother, to push them to go back, which was hard for the guards as well because there's a little baby, cute little baby. And they were in Melbourne, which for Australia was the centre of the pandemic. Like, what are you doing? You need to get this child. Anyway, so she called up and said visa, hung up. Rebecca called me and said, I think she's lost it, but could you just check? And I put the phone down and I burst into hysterical tears because I'd worked on this case for 2 years and I had legally nothing left. If they tried to deport the mother again, I couldn't stop it. So I was very conscious of that. And then I called the case manager, and after a bit of to and froing, they're like, yeah, she's got a visa. So the little girl who was never in detention apparently was then released from the place she never was, because you don't want to put her in the statistics because that would make Australia look bad.
Yeah. How many kids are born in Australian detention?
I don't think anyone knows those statistics.
Because they never, ever record it.
They would record it somewhere, but not that's publicly known. If there's one instance of a baby being a guest, there has to be others. You know, with the way this government works, there absolutely has to be others. So, but at the moment, I don't have any children who are clients, which is fantastic. I'm very happy with that.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was another great moment.
Yeah. How often do you have kids?
Look, the numbers have been falling, have fallen dramatically. At one point, there were hundreds of children in detention, and particularly in offshore, and there are still kids. I think that there might be some of the older kids left on Nauru, but I'm not an expert in that area. It's very rare now to have children in detention because they just take the fathers. It's almost the same as far as I'm concerned. And then we have the kids who have aged out, who arrived when they were children and have just never left detention. So I have a couple of those as clients who are now young men still just sitting there.
For like 10
Yeah,
years.
7, 8, 9 years. Yeah. Could you imagine if you were meant to be in year 10 and you were detained and now you're 25 and you're still detained?
Where do you go?
Where'd you go? And what is your family doing? Their lives are on hold as well. So sometimes, you know, this is in families where there's no male head of the household. So they would release the women but keep
A son. Oh, that's vicious.
Yeah.
So wrong.
You want to avoid comparing what's happening in Australia to concentration camps and gulags but for the people living it, that's what it's like.
Yeah.
And then they get out into the Australian community and realise that we're nothing like that at all.
Yeah.
But all they've seen is incredibly poor treatment. And one of the groups that we try and focus on is LGBTI people, because they are incredibly vulnerable in detention. So we've got a campaign for a gentleman at the moment who has been detained for 7 years again, because when he first arrived and he got off the boat, he didn't put his hand up and go, hello, darlings, I'm so gay right now. You know, he's come from a Middle Eastern country where he had the shit beaten out of him when they found out he was in a same-sex relationship. So, of course, he didn't disclose that to random people he just met in a foreign country using an interpreter from his country, you know, like. And that, when eventually he said, no, actually the reason is because I'm pansexual or bisexual or whatever it is, that has impacted his credibility so much that the department won't reopen his case.
Really?
Yep.
What's his process moving forward?
He hasn't got one at this point in time, so he's literally, again, just sitting there. And because detention centres are full of a mixture of people, he's too afraid to live his authentic self within the detention centre.
Yeah.
So he's still not able to come out. He has a transgender partner in the community that met online, been together for a number of years. They've never met in person because he's so worried about the danger to his health and her health and safety. So we're exactly the same as the regime he fled from. So we're trying to get external advocacy groups in place to build a campaign that then we can go to some sympathetic politicians to try a creative alternative way just to get this man's case reopened.
Yeah.
Just to go through procedural fairness.
Mm.
So, but if you have presented a claim straight off the plane or straight off the boat that you've been told to say by people smugglers or something else, and then you change your story, you're screwed.
Yeah.
We have a number of those issues, which should be relatively easy to solve, but turns out not. Takes years.
Yeah. Yeah.
No behavioural record in detention. Just a very lovely but damaged individual who
is fleeing persecution.
Yep. So it's ironic, the gay Saudi journalists, and I use that phrase so I don't have to name them. What was the eventual strong push factor for them to leave Saudi Arabia was they were called in separately to police stations. They'd been called into police station. One of them had previously, but not the other. And this time they were both called in at the same time, but in separate rooms. Mm-hmm. And so they were going to be detained. So they fled. Makes perfect sense to me. Then they get to Australia and the very thing that they were trying to avoid happened. They were detained.
Yeah.
And this is what we were trying to avoid in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. But as journalists, wouldn't they have information in regards to Australian immigration processes?
They looked up seeking asylum in Australia and nothing about detention came up.
Wow.
Mm. But then when they were released, they were on a bus and they sent me this hilarious, they took a photograph of next stop and it came up Villawood, and Villawood's the name of the detention centre. Next stop Villawood, and sent me this photo saying, this should be put on planes coming to Australia if you're seeking asylum. I was like, yeah, it should.
So the information really isn't available?
No, and it's not. And sometimes it's put in formats that are just ridiculous. So I lived in Indonesia for a number of years, and it was when there were a lot of boats arriving in Australia. And I remember looking in the Jakarta Post, the English language newspaper in Indonesia, if you come to Australia via boat, you will never get a visa. You will never be able to stay. And then warnings about crocodiles and sharks and all sorts of other things. And I was like, how many people smugglers and refugees do they think are buying the English language newspaper in Indonesia? I mean, what a waste of money. I just looked, I was like, that is ridiculous. No. And then a week later you saw it popping up in Indonesian and Arabic and Farsi and other things. And I was like, oh, okay, but no one has any money.
Yeah.
If you looked at the cost of stupid decisions that have been made in this space for the Australian taxpayer, it would be massive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're just perpetuated. They get in this narrative of border protection and, at any cost.
Yeah.
And as we've, discussed, we've signed up to treaties that say you cannot penalise somebody coming to Australia to seek asylum. You cannot treat them differently in most respects to your citizens, and you certainly can't detain them indefinitely. And yet, here we are.
Mm. Yeah. Alison, you are amazing.
Thank you, Jenna. So are you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. I love talking.
Yeah, you are so important. And I hope that a lot of people listen to this podcast and
educate yourself and get a law degree and help me.
There you go, guys.
You can get one in 3 years in Australia. Do it.
And she'll be waiting on the other end with open arms.
I will be waiting. Yeah, just need to get some funding. I'll figure it out.
Funders out there?
Yeah, subtle call. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you. You're incredible. Thank you to my friend and human rights defender Alison Battisson for joining us today on the Loving Podcast. To help Alison continue her groundbreaking work at Human Rights for All, you can head to thelovingpodcast.com and click on Alison. For more information on today's show, you can head to the show notes, and you can also check out our socials at The Loving Podcast on Insta and Facebook. Next week, we chat with legendary Indigenous activist Uncle Bruce Shillingsworth and talk about how we can use Indigenous wisdom to preserve and protect our environment for future generations. And what natural food would you grow in these communities? Like bush tomatoes, yams?
Yeah, bush tomatoes, you got fruits, nuts, berries.
Are there still kangaroos and emus and other animals that are, living in these areas close by the river?
Look, there are lots of animals out there. But then
okay.
you got the farmers with the fence that, they stopped a lot of the First Nation people getting to access to hunting those animals as well and getting their bush tucker. So I think there needs to be a more communication or relationship between, the farmers on the land and First Nation people.
Big love to you all.
The Loving Podcast is a One Love Films original podcast. It is recorded at Forbes Street Studios, Woolloomooloo, by Charlotte Rochecouste and Nicholas Rowse. Our editors are Zoltan Fetcho and Jenna Chanel Hayes. Our music is composed by Jenna Pratt and guitarist Joshua Gonzalez. Podcast photography and cover art is created by Sarah Fountain. Our behind-the-scenes photographers/videographers are Danielle Mazzucci, Barnaby Downs, Paul King and Ryan Andrew Lee. Our podcast imagery is created at Innkeeper Studios. I am your narrator, Victoria Jane Hind, and our producer is Jenna Chanel Hayes.